Всем привет, это проект Альфа.
Hello, everybody. This is Project Alpha. My name is Nikolai Feldman. This is War Diary with Alexey Arestovich. We're launching live. Hi, Alexey. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, Nikolai. All right, let's start with taking stock of the results on the previous week. We promised some results, but as usual, it went completely to smithereens. All the negotiations were interrupted. But I do want us to maybe start with interaction between India and Pakistan, two nuclear countries. And there are some risks that this is not a good conflict. As some analysts see it, can you spare a couple of words in that direction? What are the causes? What should we worry about, if we should? All right, Nikolai. So let's start it in an orderly fashion. What's the name, what's the title of that week you gave to the previous week? The Moment of Truth? Right, it was the 45th week of truth. Just like that saying, the last Chinese morning, right? So there'll be likely more weeks like that. By the way, India-Pakistani war is a similar event. In the Soviet times, in stand-up comedy, there was a joke that basically was saying that the ambassador of some imaginary country was presenting to the Politburo in Soviet Union, saying that during the last 20 revolutions that happened this year in our country, nothing much changed in our relations with Soviet Union. Specifically, we remember revolution number 12, revolution number 17, and revolution number 19, which were followed by carnival and fireworks. So people should not be technically worried about what's happening between India and Pakistan. That's where I'm going with this. They've already fought at least twice when they were already nuclear powers. And unlike some of the commentators who are promising us nuclear dust and end of war and horrible consequences, I tend to differ with this opinion. There'll be likely some border clashes near Jammu and Kashmir. And there was another incident in the mountains. They had a few skirmishes there. They have a long border. They could even fight along the whole border. There could be some jets shooting other jets. But human propensity for trying to scare each other, I'm just always amazed at this. In Ukraine, we have our own issues with ballistic missiles falling in our hands, and yet we have people really concerned with what's happening in India and Pakistan. And people start talking about India and Pakistan. Those are two nuclear countries. What if it'll explode? Same Ukrainians who are getting attacked by Russia daily. And then in the next post, they're writing, oh, we need a nuclear bomb so we can drop it on Russia. And we would not be afraid, apparently, of nuclear war with Russia, yet India and Pakistan conflict scares us somewhat. So this is our logic. There is an anecdote that Aristotle, when he invented logic, he killed 40 sheep to celebrate it. And ever since, the sheep do not really like logic. So, all right, Alexei. Now we have two nuclear countries threatening each other still, India and Pakistan, threatening with a full arsenal, and we are supposed to take that with some degree of calm. Are they more responsible than we are in Ukraine, or what's the secret? Well, look, Nikolai, how it works. When India and Pakistan were separated upon the leave of Brits in 1948, because before that, there was one country, that started an incident which took away about 2 million lives on both sides in a couple months. And most of them were killed with axes, agriculture equipment, sticks, stones, and stuff like that. And when in 99 they had another clash for a certain piece of Himalayan mountains, they, I think, lost something like 600 or 700 people on both sides. So the moral of the story is the higher level of development of opponents, the smaller the losses are in the war. Or this at least seems to be the trend now. In this war that we have with Russia, for the first time in 100 years, we have a strange correlation between civilians and military who died on the battlefront. And we have tens or maybe even 100 times less civilians dead than the soldiers. That has not been the case starting at least 1945 at minimum. In the Vietnamese War, for one dead military soldier, there were at least 20 civilians dead. Korean War, they also had overwhelming imbalance in terms of losing more civilian lines. And yet, on our war here, we have very few civilians who are suffering. They are suffering, but in terms of losses, it's mostly military personnel that is dying on both sides. So the character of wars is changing. And I'm looking at this thinking that the more nuclear powers like India and Pakistan are in conflict, the less casualties there'll be. Because nuclear arms, at its core, it's the weapon of annihilation. It's the weapon of defense. It's not an attack weapon. Nuclear war is the last-ditch resort to defend yourself. Because normal war is serving the extension of politics to bind your opponent to your will, but if you completely destroy your opponent, the whole matter of binding and bending them to your will basically becomes null. And all the technological development, in my view, leads to a more balanced approach during conflicts. And given countries that do not have nuclear weapons, they do not have anything to be shy about, and the level of escalation and level of deaths goes out of control. Yet when two countries can ultimately destroy each other, they fight according to certain rules. And, the biggest ones, they fight in tariff wars. That was the secret of nukes. They were done to be the weapons of prevention, the weapons of holding. The problem was that we built too many of them, and if we didn't have nukes, United States and Soviet Union would have had a clash, a direct military conflict. And so they continued to produce nukes to prevent this conflict, and by the way, they did. They succeeded. There was never a direct war between these two countries. All right, Alexey, so in this logic, Ukrainians who want nukes, they generally are going on the way to minimizing the casualties. Right, they do want, Nikolai, they do want to have nukes, but I also want a lot of things. For example, I would love to have consciousness of people to elevate to a new level, but, these are nice wants. So Ukrainian wants about nukes, they go against the phase of history where they are. We're not currently in a place where we should have these kind of weapons. All right, Alexey, let's go back to the moment of truth, that week that passed, and I want to ask you several questions in this regard. Negotiations in London failed. Why, in your opinion? Who is to blame? Well, because Brits, I think, Nikolai, explained to Zelensky that he has to disrupt these negotiations in London. First, London was picked because it was a strategic point. Why did they move it to London? Because Zelensky asked to move it, and his request was honored, because they could have continued doing that in Saudi Arabia, right? So it was London, and then he was asked to disrupt it, and it was disrupted very lightly, very easily. The day before the negotiation, he gave an interview where he was scandalous and hysterical, and of course, after such an interview, all the serious negotiators refused to participate there. That's when Trump, if you remember, asked this question: why do you want to conduct loudspeaker politics? If you don't want to do something, you can reach out and explain why and negotiate. Why do you need to scream in front of everybody and provoke different parties and opponents to the negotiations? And the answer is simple: because Zelensky's butt is stuck to the throne, and it's very painful for him to let it go. Look, Alexey, he was commenting the publication of Wall Street Journal, I think. So somebody leaked that information into Wall Street Journal for Zelensky to comment on. Do you think Ukraine partook in this process? No, I think this was coordinated with Moscow to draft the outline of the peace treaty and to indicate what an idiot Zelensky is on this backdrop. Pre-meeting in London, everything was already prearranged. And Putin gave us a straight signal that he is ready to sign documents, his side is ready, and that agreement should have been signed on that week, maximum the next one. And everything fell through. We'd have had to fly to Moscow and explain to Russians that Americans will give it another try, that do not abandon the idea of negotiations yet, we're all still interested. So, Alexey, why do you think that public signal needs to go out that Russians and Americans have already agreed upon something? Because that kind of forces Zelensky into commenting on this. Of course, it does. It does force him to comment on meetings with Trump in Vatican and other statements that he made before. So they push him, they pressure him to comment on his earlier promises, to push him to actually execute on the Ukrainian promises. All right, so Alexei, the meeting in London was said to be a way to consolidate Ukraine, Britain, and United States. So they were supposed to sign, Nikolai, they were supposed to create a document, a communique that would be pre-arranged, negotiated, and then signed by these three parties, and Russia should have signed it after. So this was already developed as a framework document, and based on this document, the war could have been stopped already. All right, so you've been commenting, Alex, on the Trump's plan as ideal. It does not look ideal to me. From the side of Ukraine, if you look at it, I don't think it is. Question number one, why United States need to acknowledge Crimea as Russian territory? This creates a bad practice, I think, because it creates a path for other countries to acknowledge Crimea as the Russian territory, and then also that opens a door to acknowledge Russian sovereignty over other occupied territories. So, from which point of view is it bad? From Nikolai, from the point of view of Trump, who wants Greenland and Canada, potentially? Oh, that's how you look at it, right? And nobody forced Ukraine to acknowledge Crimea being Russian territory. Nobody's forcing Ukraine to do that. We are screaming here, Zelensky is screaming in Ukraine that this is false, this is bad, but nobody's forcing Ukraine to acknowledge it. Americans can acknowledge whatever they want. That's their right. That's fine. We do not have to in Ukraine. I don't see a conflict. So, Alexei, do you see that as a part of a new world order, to start acknowledging what was acquired on the battlefront? No, Nikolai, this is a part of a very old world order that was in existence for the last 10 million years till about 1945, and then for 80 years it was paused, and apparently it's not really succeeding the new shape. So the old one is looming over it. This is a picture of Peter Bruegel, the elder, the senior, a big fish eating a small fish. And regardless of how big the fish is, there's always some other big fish that is eating it. And however little the fish is, there's usually a smaller fish that it can eat. And that's how it is working in the world politics. Global politics is exploited and organized by cannibals. And the sooner you understand that, the better. And when somebody tries to demand some justice because you were attacked, because you're a victim in this case, this is a kindergarten appeal. It's really uncomfortable to comment on this, yet some politicians build the whole position of the country and their politics on this, demand for acknowledgement without any power behind it. Alexey, so if Trump wanted to have consolidated position with Europe, EU and Britain, he should have probably understood that in Europe they are against acknowledgement of Russian sovereignty over any occupied territory. All right, Nikolai, because most of modern Europe is organized on Helsinki Agreement of 75 about the non-destructive borders in Europe by any conflict. But they have violated that many times, starting with war in Yugoslavia, then fallout from USSR, disintegration, where there's a bunch of unacknowledged territories that sprung up, Abkhazia, Donetsk, Lugansk republics, and the others. And even that is not the most important. Ukrainians, like most Russian-speaking peoples, or people who can understand what we're talking here about in Russian, they do not want to acknowledge or do not understand a secret of NATO, that it was not created against Soviet Union. The main goal of NATO, the encroachment of which Putin's Russia are so afraid of, the main goal of NATO, the main purpose of it, was to prevent Europeans from squabbling with each other. You can type up somewhere online the maps of battles throughout human history. And there are not too many in Latin America or in Asia, but in every European capital, you can find several monuments to their soldiers taking other capitals, and sometimes there are different monuments in the same city to different armies, having taken it many times. So this was basically an ongoing battlefront for too long. And then it led to eventually First World War, Second World War, and Hitler's attempt to create his own Reich. And then when that failed, they recreated the European Union. Inside NATO, there are 33 unagreed to problematic territorial problems. You can look up British Icelandic fishing wars. You can read about Gibraltar, the deathly fights between Britain and Spain over it. You can read about French and Italian territorial arguments, or Belgium and Holland issues. I'm not even talking about naval issues yet. So if United States leave Europe, Europeans should probably be more concerned not about Russia, but about them starting to squabble between each other. So Europe was being very meticulously castrated, starting with the Germany, the main enfant terrible in Europe, and then they did that with everything else, every other country in Europe. And those tough dudes from the United States were the ones who actually executed that plan. The guys from East Europe, they eventually withdrew, the ones who are serving in most of European legions and armies. And NATO, the tough guys from America, are still looking over it. And when the Soviet Union started to fall apart, NATO was consuming those fallouts from this disintegration so that they would not be facing the same scenarios in Yugoslavia. In Romania, there is at least 1 million or 1.5 million of Hungarians who would probably want to go back to Hungary. There are some Germans, hundreds of thousands. New president, actually the president of Romania, is actually German. He doesn't speak good Romanian, according to some Romanians. So Europe is a Klondike in terms of looking for arguments and looking for wars. And NATO is looking over that. And this is a very old story, very old story between United States and Soviet Union. Let me ask you a test question. When the Victory Day of the Second World War became a holiday in Soviet Union? I'm trying to remember that it was not too immediately after the war, Alexey, right? Yeah, it was made a holiday in 1965. In 1965, in Vienna, in one four-story building, there was an interesting organization set up that was called Institute of Problems of Europe. I think that was the name. And it was jointly organized by United States and Soviet Union. 1965. And we've been told that this is the height of the Cold War. And Europe started to raise their heads. Prague Spring, Paris Spring, these are very similar processes. Soviet Union was canceling the uprisings in Prague, and de Gaulle was canceling mutinies in Sorbonne. And by the way, Soviet Union was not bloodier than de Gaulle. Look at his score fighting the students. And the same Sartors and the like were inspiring the same uprisings on both sides of Europe, the East Europe and the West Europe. And emancipation of that Europe, that was the new generation that was growing in Europe after the Second World War, it presented a big problem, big potential conflict. And I think savvy historians would be exploring a lot of interesting materials about how Soviet Union and United States jointly have pacified Europe in those years. And another question to our audience. Do you think the situation has changed much since those days? Probably not too much, Alexey, right? Americans are still waiting for a clear suggestion from Russia. Let's jointly control Europe. And this is an obvious suggestion, very natural to American-Russian relations. And when we are trying to invent why Trump or any other president in the United States is not hitting Moscow with nukes, we fail to understand the core essence of American-Russian relations. And finally, we have somebody in the White House, in the face of Trump, who said, well, listen, we'll buy gas from Russia and sell it via our joint venture to Europe. And let's bring French and Brits and other peacekeepers into Ukraine, so they would be busy with that. And then make sure that Europe probably will be supplying Ukraine with the weapons and will be blackmailing them with threatening with our possible leaving NATO, so they would actually prop up their military-industrial complex to a better shape. So this is a long problem with the United States. They're still deciding whether they want to send Europe to hell and just make money on it, or whether they want to control it. And it seems like the second strategy is not really liked, and it's the first one that they're using, or going to use now, at least with this president. And Russia and United States generally, history-wise, have a long history of understanding each other in terms of dealing with Europe. And that's why, by the way, in Europe, there are a lot of right-side parties growing that are standing on both anti-American and anti-Russian slogans. And they could be temporarily aligning with Russia to underline that they're against America, or aligning with America to underline that they're against Russia. Now that in America the rights are prevailing, the situation there is different too, so it may change the layout, but American-Russian relations are not about Europe, and American-Soviet relations before that. They're not about Ukraine, of course. So the document that is not liked by Ukrainians, and it's less than ideal, why do you even think it needs to be ideal? It's not about Ukraine. By the way, this document, in my view, is ideal. Ukraine doesn't have any argument besides moral that could force this document to be better. I expected this document to be 5 times worse. For example, Alexey. For example, there would be no talk about Kinberg Spit, and it's not just a random geographic feature at the mouth of Dnieper. This is the definition of our vessels having access to sea. We're not talking about Americans taking over any nuclear station to be the administrator of the energy for Russia and Ukraine. They're not talking about that. So Americans are holding to their previous promises and agreements. They're realizing the goal that they set. And the goal can be formulated as Ukraine needs to not only not lose this war, it needs to survive as a sovereign country. And it means it needs economic basis for its existence, and it needs to acknowledge elements of real geography. And if in this global document you read about certain geographic landmarks like Kinberg Spit, that means that the document was actually very well thought through. And they also do talk there about the economic revival of Ukraine, including that fund, rare earth minerals, why Americans are stubborn and don't want to proceed until the matter of deal with Ukraine is sealed. Because for them, Ukraine without the deal will not be able to economically exist after this war. Americans are logical people. They do not work in a different fashion. They understand that it's not enough to just finish this war and conduct the ceasefire arrangements. You need to enable the territory, that shard of USSR, that country of Ukraine, to be able to exist after. So that's why they are creating that economic basis for it. And just forcing everybody to peace doesn't matter by itself. It's not a value in itself. And the fact that Ukraine is stubbornly against and poking at this document and this agreement, that really pisses off Trump. But in my view, the document is ideal. And I think that Ukraine, with our EDSC treachery to ourselves and our partners and our people, I don't think we deserve even half of this document. So for Ukraine, in its current state, it's an ideal document. It actually takes a lot of pity and proactive steps to help Ukraine. All right, still, Alexey, it is considered that for Europeans, acknowledgement of sovereignty of Russia over some of the occupied Ukrainian territories is unacceptable, as it violates certain principles of borders in Europe, and it also creates certain issues with sanctioning Russia later. Is it the overall stalemate or what? Nikolai, why do Europeans matter in this case? Well, sanctions need to be removed, Alexei, together with Europeans. Oh, I see. Okay. Americans will probably be removing their sanctions, the ones that they applied on Russia since 2014. Europe probably will keep theirs. But I am telling you, as soon as the normal trade will reinstate between Russia and the United States, Europeans will start thinking about that alleviation too, because they don't want to be sitting in the corner at this feast of life. Look, this is an important clarification because very often it was presented as a joint, as a connectedness. No, this, Nikolai, is misinformation, disinformation used by the Ukrainian government against its own people. Because they present that Ukraine is needed to acknowledge Russia annexation of Crimea and acknowledge it being Russian. And then if you dig deeper, you realize that no, it's only America that is acknowledging that, and they do not demand Ukraine to acknowledge anything. Then the next part is, okay, so we are looking at America lifting up some of the sanctions of Russia, and EU will likely boycott that. Well, that's not an issue. If the United States remove some of the sanctions, Europe may still keep theirs. There is no conflict. And this is not just a mistake by editors of different channels who were supposedly lazy or something to dig into the weeds. No, this is information politics, officially instituted by Zelensky's government. And, you know, I do not like what they're doing because this is the method of really dark card players, the ones who cheat, the ones who do not even try to be honest. You know, Nikolai, for example, you always try to check the data. When you prepare yourself for the stream, oh yeah, I'm trying, Alexey. Right, even if you get something during the stream, you try to verify that. And in Ukraine, they're peddling that, listen, we cannot alleviate sanctions from Russia, we cannot stand for that. Well, yeah, but this is half-truth. The truth is that United States want to probably alleviate some of the sanctions if Russia agrees to a ceasefire. Europe does not have to. And it's okay to be different. It's okay that each country keeps its own sanctions or works its own thing. It reminds me of an old movie, Soviet times, when American and Russian intelligence officers are talking. And American spy is saying, you know, every Soviet person whom I talk to always speak like your newspaper Pravda. To which a Russian spy replies, well, what do you want them to talk like New York Times? And that's the point that Trump is making. There's no need for loudspeaker politics where you can actually agree to things much more productively in a quiet atmosphere. And look, when the signal did not go through, when the London meeting was cancelled, when there was the escalation, another hit on Kiev by Russia, something occurred there that officials from Trump's side are saying that we are as close to a peace deal as ever. And then Peskov, Putin's speaker, comes out, and then Lavrov and Putin supposedly speaks through them, are saying that we are ready to sign peace deal without any preconditions. And when in the last almost 4 years or 11 years if you count from 2014, Russia was ready to negotiate with Ukraine without any preconditions. Never. Except for Istanbul agreements when the war just started. This is by itself is a huge signal. But somehow our media in Ukraine is missing that. We instead have clowns of the third or fourth tiers who are jumping for joy saying that we'll never acknowledge Crimea, that that's what they want us to acknowledge. Who cares about what you think in Ukraine? What changes if you do not acknowledge Crimea to be a Russian territory? It doesn't change anything. Big players can behave the way they like. And imagine the United States capture Greenland one way or another under Trump. Do they care if Ukraine or Denmark acknowledge this annexation? No, they only would care about China and Russia perhaps acknowledging it. And if there is a Russian vessel entering the port of Greenland with some cargo and create certain unloading, customs procedures on American laws, who will object? Denmark? Ukraine? Denmark and Ukraine will send a fleet to stop Russian vessels and to fight America? What matters is the agreement between two big countries. And Russia and states can circumnavigate even China. And I would be curious to see how China would be, what China would be doing or could do against joint Russian-American actions. And this is a situation where both countries have enough arguments to agree and to start living well. And they bring certain things for Ukraine, and they share certain setup of the post-war world with Ukraine that is actually surprising to me that they do care about Ukraine, the state specifically. And I think a couple of years ago, I said, maybe at Fagan's interview or maybe at your stream, I did mention that the size of concessions from Russia will be surprising to us, not because they want Ukraine to be so successful, but because they understand how sweet of a candy do they get when the ceasefire strikes. And there is no ceasefire still for only one reason. That reason has a last name starting with Z and ends with a E, and it's not Zelensky. Who could that be, right? This is the only reason, while there is no agreement, neither globally nor locally, people are still dying on the front. That reason has that last name, and it's not Zelensky. I know our listeners know that, but yeah. Well, okay, Alexey. It seems that we're talking only about American-Russian relations in this case, that the United States will likely alleviate sanctions from Russia, and this is part of a deal. Then why do they need to consolidate their position with Europe? Well, that's a big question, Nikolai. And the question is which strategy will prevail, whether they will do that jointly, and Europe will likely join with that tune, or whether Russia and America will be milking Europe together without Europe agreeing to that. And there is also Britain that'll be doing some shenanigans. And yeah, that's United States option. They'll bring some Europeans as peacekeepers into the thing. Russia will be scaring them a little bit in Baltic. United States will be selling them arms in Europe from their side. Or they have a choice to offer Europe, EU to play together. So there's no need to do that bait and switch. And it seems like there is some intermediate option that is currently being popular. Europe is softly being drawn into the solution of this conflict. Maybe they were not let into negotiations for a reason, so that they would want to partake more. And then conditionally, they're let in. Right, and they conditionally let into negotiations with a certain price, right? So they need to do something for that. Exactly, Nikolai. So you wanted to be a partake at the negotiation table? Right, we even agreed to hold the negotiations in London, but the terms are that you need to actively be peacekeeping. And if you can't, well, let's see what else can you do. You need to contribute something to the table too. All right. That's an interesting angle. but continuation of this story is the joint position to be developed by Ukraine and Europe, I think. Or do they have to be separate, Alexei, plus Britain, and bring that statement to Trump's table that was likely apparently delivered to United States? Then Zelensky and Trump had contact in Vatican at the funeral of Pope, and after this contact, Trump supposedly having position of Zelensky on his table, he supposedly that position is agreed with EU. Trump is poking at Russian Federation. How can that be understood or interpreted? Well, you can look at it in a couple of ways. One is if it is prearranged, that he needs to be angry at Putin too for a play, for a show, because he cannot be just angry with Zelensky all the time. And another option is that Russia is slow-walking something and Trump decided to bark at them a little. Given that Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs right after that came out and said, oh, we are ready without any preconditions to go into the deal, that probably implies that second option was true. And yeah, they're likely getting pushed to agree to everything as well. So speaking of preconditions that Russian Federation is not even setting up to negotiate, last year they initially proposed for Ukraine to withdraw troops from 4 districts, and only then Russia can negotiate. Now Russia says that we do not need you to do that, no preconditions, we can sit down and start negotiating. But there is also a position about peace treaty for the 9th of May that is announced by Putin already. On the 8th of May it's supposed to commence till 10th or 11th of May to celebrate the Russian victory in the Second World War. That is their holiday. And they're looking to celebrate that with vigor in Moscow, and that's why they need that truce at the front. And Russia considers that 30-day truce is unnecessary in this case, so they're ready to sit down and negotiate without any preconditions. They don't look to ceasefire for 30 days. And we saw the statement from Kellogg that Trump is supporting Zelensky's position about 30-day ceasefire. Right, Nikolai. It is pushing on Trump that by the end of April he needs to reach some ceasefire or stop this war in some capacity. So America and EU will also be celebrating victory in the Second World War, but they'll be doing that on the 8th of May. And this is a very important gesture. Look, this is a big holiday. We're not shooting. Russia is going for this for purpose because foreign dignitaries who wants may visit Moscow on this day. Europe will probably be visiting the English Channel, Le Mans, and some other historic sites. But this is essentially a card given to Trump, saying that, allowing him to say that, look, we have not stopped the war, but at least we reached some ceasefire by that time. And Putin may not probably stop the whole war at the point, but he at least gives something to Trump, so Trump can present himself in a good light. Second, Trump cannot not support Zelensky, right? Since it is very loud in the open space, Trump cannot say that we don't need a 30-day ceasefire, right? Let's start with maybe a 3-day or a 3-hour ceasefire, right? That would be strange if he suggested that. Of course, he is supportive of Zelensky's suggestion for a 30-day ceasefire. If somebody offered 180 days, he would be for that too. This is diplomatic moves. If you are about ceasefire and about ending war, you need to talk about removal of sanctions for Russia because, sure, you will have all economic benefits once you stop fighting with Ukraine, right? I recommend you to watch a movie called The Glass of Water. There is a fight between a duke and a duchess, and they say only good words about each other, but they're so filled with poison that you understand what does it mean to be a proper courtier. It teaches you how to give compliments so that your opponent would want to die upon hearing them. This is how international diplomacy works. Look, if I was an official person right now, I could come out and say, fellas, I offer a 4-day ceasefire or a 31-day ceasefire. And if it would be a person of the level to which Trump needs to react, he would say, sure, we will support your ceasefire. There are no options. He cannot come out and say we're against the ceasefire. So it is not that he is supposedly supporting Zelensky or not supporting Putin or anything. I think everything is already pre-agreed to a certain degree. And I'm trying to say it very softly, especially between Americans and Russians. Looking at all these official statements. All right, Alexey, on one hand, I understand everything. On the other hand, I don't. Well, for Putin, it's simple too, of course. He also needs a ceasefire, so there would not be UAVs hitting his tribune at the mausoleum upon him receiving the parade at the Red Square in Moscow. So this is the main reason for Putin to see that, to present that, hey, listen, there could be a ceasefire when the whole world is celebrating a victory over fascism. Moscow is winking at Ukraine, saying that, hey, Ukraine could also celebrate victory over fascism. But everybody else does. French, Brits, United States celebrate that, and Russia is celebrating it too. And since they came out first with a ceasefire suggestion, they can present it that everybody is celebrating it in the same fashion because of the Russian suggestion. We could have suggested something too, but we're dumb. We're quiet and dumb in this case. And a proper exit for us in this case would be, what do you expect from us? We are defending side, right? How can we initiate the ceasefire if you are attacking us? It's only the side that is attacking, that is aggressively attacking, can initiate the ceasefire. The defending side is conducting a defense operation. It is defending its country. It is not in the position to initiate a ceasefire. So it is the one who is the aggressor who is initiating that. Because if Zelensky would say, hey, ceasefire is on that date, Putin can ignore it and continue steamrolling, right? So this is how you explain why Putin has to come out with a ceasefire and not Zelensky. So we are defending, right? We can present however moral we are, but it's just physical limitation. And again, you can poke at Russian Federation saying that, no, we're not against ceasefire. We actually love it. It's just you guys continue attacking us. And that's the whole explanation. But that's not what we're doing. In Ukraine, instead, we're saying, look, Putin declared a ceasefire. Remember that one day for Easter, we, in our media, are chasing some Russian UAV that is attacking Ukraine, or an FPV drone that is chasing a vehicle on the front. Putin is lying. That's what's highlighted in Ukraine media, that he is lying and cheating on us and on Trump. This is the wrong way to approach it. We should be saying that we cannot declare a ceasefire because we are defending side. It has never been like that in the whole history of humankind. It is always the aggressor that can declare ceasefire. That's why, dear Trump and the whole world, please address it to Russian Federation. Why there is still no ceasefire? And this is the right diplomacy for Ukraine. Unfortunately, we cannot do that. We're chasing low-flying UAVs and proving that Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. There is a good anecdote about small people. When a little fella, brings a girl to introduce her to his parents, and his dad takes him for a minute for a word in another room and says, hey, Sonny, I am barely 5 feet. Your mom is 4.5 feet. You are a little lower than mom. You brought a girl who is significantly lower than you. If we continue this trend, we'll go down till the size of mice. So the politics in Ukraine basically leads us, the vector is in bringing all us down to the level of, I don't know, pet fleas. And it hurts me when I see what Ukraine is doing the country that I'm a citizen of, there is a word in Ukraine, bolech. I did not heard for 4 years. I was working and I was busy. But I'm looking at what our country is doing. I feel that word. I feel that pain. And in this regard, I can say I'm very similar to many other people on social media. That's when what comes to my mind when I see a ton of Ukrainians following some of random Russian UAV when Putin declared ceasefire and attacking Russia, that they're not for ceasefire. So that you could understand the perspective, Ukraine suggested to have an international conference during the day of the funeral of Roman Pope. All my diplomat friends grabbed their heads asking, what the F? Seriously, how can you even come with that offer at the day of the funeral? And our Ministry of Foreign Affairs comes out with a very surprised look saying, why? What? Something not working? And I'll show you something here on my phone, trying to show that meme. And it says, any male after fixing an electric plug. See that monkey smoking? This is what I see when I hear these signals coming from Zelensky office. And that's what I think our diplomats look like when they're being told that you do not conduct meetings like that on the day like that. And they're sitting like this, chimp, smoking and asking, what, why? Right? And the same thing when they're highlighting a certain drone or UAV flying somewhere alongside the 1,000-mile front line. And they chased a couple of those cases saying that Russia is violating it. And when you come to them suggesting, hey, you cannot declare a ceasefire because you're defending side, they're sitting there smoking like the chimp saying, well, why? What's up? Why not? Nothing. It just you'll never succeed with such approach. And you'll always be frustrated sitting again in a weird position thinking, why is everybody against us? Why nobody is listening to us? Why, right? While being wise and playing on the contradiction of the interests of different sides is possible, it's an alternative, but one needs to be smart enough to see that and skilled enough to use it. All right, Alexey, let's summarize it. The 9th of May is approaching. Putin will be celebrating that on his goddamn Red Square. They will have some jets flying, apparently. By the way, nobody declared ceasefire on the 9th of May during the previous 3 years of war, right? Neither in 22, nor in 23, nor in 24. There were no initiatives like that. So it looks like there is, I think, a big wish with a lot of people in Ukraine who want to launch a UAV in that general direction where Putin's Russia will be celebrating. Nikolai, why? Alexey, what do you mean? Well, my question is, do they want to express emotions or achieve a long-standing ceasefire and peace? Well, our hands are itching, Alexey. Okay, hands are itching, I get it. But human has a neocortex, supposedly, which differentiates us from that monkey, giving us a chance to think it through before reacting when something itches. So, okay, imagine we are super successful sending the UAV to the Red Square during that parade, killing Putin and maybe 500 of his soldiers. What will happen after? Well, there probably will be some answers to that, right? Yeah, exactly. They might drop a nuke on Kiev. You think it'll be a nuke? Well, that event might cause such kind of retaliation. Well, I don't think it'll likely happen. I don't think we'll hit Putin. Okay, well, imagine. We're successful and Russia hits us with another ballistic missile in Odessa or Kiev or someplace else. And Russia responds to our screams saying, well, why? Why are you upset? You're hitting us, we're hitting you. And then what do you want strategically? Do you know another anecdote when there are two bums sitting after a hearty meal, found cigarette butt and a used newspaper, and one of them is reading a newspaper and is saying very surprised tone, "Oh my God, Honduras is really worrying me." The other one takes a smoke, takes a drag from a cigarette and says, "Well, if Honduras is really bothering you, just don't teach it, don't scratch it." Right, so that's my question. What is your target in Ukraine? Do you want to ceasefire and get to the economic compensation and start figuring out how to rebuild? Or do you want to successfully hit Red Square and prolong the war for another 6 months? All right, Alexey, if I guess the answer is if the drones will fly towards Red Square, it will be obvious that President Zelensky does not want any ceasefire, any truce, and he wants to continue it and at least extend it for another 6 months. 100%, Nikolai. Right, I'm asking, Alexey, just to help people to understand. If they see that, that's what happens. Oh yeah, here, see, our listeners already sent me that meme, that monkey with the word. Oh, what happened? Remember, this is the face of central signal in Ukraine, of Ukraine diplomacy under Zelensky. Very itchy, right? I'll ask our users to add one more thing. Okay, Alexey. So there is David Sachs, an advisor to Trump, who, despite the statements by other people, including Trump himself, accused Zelensky in sabotaging the peace deal. According to his statement, Zelensky is refusing suggested solution by United States, and his terms in regards of the battlefront are completely unrealistic, and Zelensky continues to be unrealistic in regards of returns of territories and behavior on the front, and understanding where does he get his aid from. And our position, he continues that if Zelensky does not understand the consequences, he should then rely on other suppliers, perhaps on Starmer and Macron, instead of United States, if he continues with this line. So, Alexey, I think there are two signals here. One is against Zelensky. The second is also highlighting Starmer and Macron, because they don't specifically take responsibility for Zelensky's actions on their shoulders, but they do apparently prop him up and present him as the point that focal point that doesn't want to agree. Nikolai, do you like intriguing stories, the secretive stories kind? Yeah, I kind of do. I think our listeners like to. I'm going to tell you now a secret history of Ukraine and Russia that many people did not know. When the God was creating Russia, Ukraine, Rus-Ukraine, back 1500 years ago. Back then he understood that in the 21st century they needed Alexey Arestovych to be sent to them, and he did send him. And I'm here with Ukrainians. Physically I'm not in Ukraine, but with my spirit I am definitely with you, right? And my body is getting tortured here in Switzerland, but my spirit is definitely there in Ukraine. So God sent them Arestovich to tell Ukrainians how things work. But devil did not stay indifferent. He carefully put a small, dark figure with a trident on each left shoulder of every Ukrainian, who is whispering in their ears, "Do not listen to him. Do not listen to him. Watch presidential telegram channels. This is where the truth is. Do not listen to others." But it is hard to stifle us. Look, I will continue tirelessly repeating how things work in this world. And they work in the following fashion. Starmer, Macron, France, Italy, Estonia, and Zelensky, they want to oppose simultaneously both Americans and Russians. And Americans and Russians They want to exploit for many tens of billions of dollars or euros that desire to oppose America and Russia by Europe and European countries. And in this regard, US and Russia have already reached certain agreement. They understand how they can make money off that situation. But when God was thinking about this situation, he also decided to send Trump for Ukraine, so that Ukraine would not repeat the story of Brest's peace of the 18th, when Germans of 1918, when Germans and the Bolsheviks have fooled both Entente and stupid Ukrainian delegation. And the situation is almost a carbon copy of that. Trump, by the way, is a rather religious person and also a kind person. So he's saying, let's include Ukrainians and Europeans into the profit scheme and let everybody make money. But at that time, Ukraine, Starmer and Macron send this signal. But why? It's itching. And that's the secret of the world politics. And Americans are saying, okay, Sachs comes out and says, if you really want to resist, but when you want to scratch your itch, have you evaluated your reach, whether you can reach that itchy part on your own without any help? Because very often you go for reaching something, but you don't know whether you succeed. My teacher used to say that, of course, you need to reach certain conclusions, but the second part of the task is more difficult, to not run away upon achieving and reaching these conclusions. So, okay, you want to scratch something, and you have grown your scratcher. Some UAV can actually reach Moscow, and France and some countries in Europe may bravely acknowledge that Crimea is not Russian. They cannot give us storm shadows, but they can still resist Russia, right? They refuse to buy natural gas from the United States and they buy it from Putin instead, but they still do not want to acknowledge annexation. So, Ukraine, what are you going to do with the consequences of all that? Imagine Americans come out and say, Vlad, they don't understand our good offers. Let us withdraw our troops from Europe and you pretend that you start a new world war, perhaps attack some Baltic countries and do whatever you want there. And what will Europeans do in this case, who are failing to create any brave European army at the moment? And frankly, they don't really want to fight for their Europe. Looking at the public polling, they will run to both, to Americans and Putin. And they both, on both sides, will tell them, look, about half a year ago or a year ago, we suggested exactly that. And you kept ignoring us, but now it'll cost you twice more expensive. That situation actually has occurred at some point, right? I think at first time it was in Istanbul, but nobody became wiser, and here we are 3 years later again. How many times do you need to repeat the same situation and the same war to understand that whenever it itches, you don't have to reflectively scratch it? Because otherwise it becomes like a memo for idiots in a book. If you enter the territory of this monastery, do not use the materials and candles purchased outside with a different monastery. Only ours work here. So it's the same cheating scheme. Everybody's cheating everybody, except for Ukraine. Ukraine is just being cheated on by all sides. While we should be more active. If you can't play these games, don't play them. But if you are, you need to be smart enough to use others. While everybody is being happy in Ukraine for our principal position, well, that principal position is great. It just doesn't work. While you're standing on this stone, everybody has already agreed to things behind your back. And this is how Ukraine ended in 1918 with the Brest peace. But it was the most horrible decision, and they failed to acknowledge, to sign other options that were on the table. So they had to eat the worst, and even after signing that, they failed, and they were consumed by Bolsheviks. And Europe is continuously being played by United States and Russia for quite a few years already, the last 80 years for sure. But if you dig deeper, some people are saying that Soviet industrialization was engineered by 120 very high-level American engineers. And the question, why were they doing it? They were just trying to avoid Great Depression. They tried, why do you think America not stopped them from helping some Soviet Union? Why did American government allow the global project of USSR industrialization to happen? Because back then they already understood who is their friend in case of any competition with Europe and who needs to continue scaring Europe together with Germany. Because there was such a thing called armed neutrality twice in American-Russian history. And when Brits wanted to create a certain naval blockade with the United States, Catherine the Great sent her ships, her vessels to America and deblockaded those routes. And it's difficult to predict how it would have played otherwise if Russia did not interfere. And that story repeated at least one more time later. So America had issues with Europe at least twice, and Russia came to American aid twice. And Americans did come to aid Russia on a couple occasions. And you can read Wikipedia or ask ChatGPT about strong and weak sides of American-Russian relations. And you can do sort of historic retrospective on that. Or just ask a question, when did America rescue Russia? Or when did Russia rescue America? And this is a very interesting, you'll discover an interesting union and certain patterns that exist. In a critical times, problems with Europe, America and Russia have to act together. This is the main conclusion you can draw from that. This is the lesson from all times history between these two countries. So what are we arguing against in Ukraine? We already were given an ideal document. Putin took enough steps back, probably for his relations with the United States and certain bonuses that he's aiming to get from Africa, from Europe, from other things. That's what driving him, giving us a certain space on this document. And yet we fail to understand it. We still demand the nuclear strike on Moscow. There won't be. How many more people, civilians, children do you need to perish in Ukraine before you understand that you need to behave differently in this world and not like that chimp that has an itch to scratch? End of the first hour.